My grandmother thought about that for a moment. Then she gave a small shrug. Maybe she doesn't want people to. That answer stayed in my mind for the rest of the day, because if the woman truly lived somewhere deep in the forest, and if she had been watching the trails and houses for years, then there was something else I couldn't stop thinking about. The night before, whoever stood outside my bedroom window had known exactly where the house was, and that meant one thing. She had probably been watching the property long before I arrived, but what I didn't realize yet was that the next time I saw her, she wouldn't be standing far away between the trees. She would be much closer, close enough for me to finally see her face clearly. After my grandmother told me the stories about the woman in the forest, I tried to treat it like one of those strange local legends every rural place seems to have. Every town has something like that, a strange person people occasionally see, a rumor that grows over time, something people talk about but never really understand. So I told myself, that's all it was. Someone living somewhere deep in the woods who preferred staying away from people. Maybe someone who had been living there long enough that the locals had simply accepted it. For the rest of that day, I tried not to think about it too much. I walked one of the shorter trails behind the house in the afternoon, but I didn't go as far as I had earlier in the week. Part of me kept expecting to see her again, standing between the trees like before. But the forest looked completely normal, sunlight filtering through the branches, birds moving through the upper limbs, wind brushing softly through the pine needles. Nothing unusual. When I returned to the house that evening, my grandmother was sitting on the front porch reading. She asked how my walk was. I told her it was quiet. She nodded, like that was exactly what she expected. As the sun began lowering behind the trees, she stood up and followed her usual evening routine. The doors were locked, the curtains were closed, the windows were checked. By now, I was starting to notice how precise the routine was. Not rushed, not nervous, just careful, like someone who had practiced the same steps for many years. Dinner that night was simple, soup and bread. We talked about normal things, family, my classes at college, the neighbors down the road, nothing about the woman in the forest. By the time we finished eating, the sky outside had turned dark. Later that night, I stayed up again in the living room, not because I was trying to listen for anything, just because I wasn't tired yet. The same small lamp was on beside the couch, the curtains over the backyard windows were closed, and the rest of the house was quiet. For a while, everything felt normal again. Then sometime around midnight, I heard it. A sound outside. This time it wasn't gravel, it was leaves. A slow rustling sound coming from the direction of the backyard. Not loud, but steady. Like someone walking carefully across the forest floor. I paused the video on my laptop and listened. The sound came again. Soft, deliberate, moving slowly between the trees. I sat very still on the couch, trying to figure out where exactly the sound was coming from. It seemed to be somewhere near the edge of the yard, right where the forest began. The movement continued for a few seconds, then it stopped, just like the footsteps on the gravel a few nights earlier. Complete silence again. I looked toward the curtains covering the windows. The porch light was off, which meant if someone was standing out there, the only light would be the faint glow from inside the living room. For a moment, I considered turning the light off. That way, whoever was outside wouldn't see inside the house. But something stopped me, because if someone really was standing near the tree line, turning off the light might make them realize I had noticed them. So instead, I stayed where I was, listening. The silence stretched on. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Then slowly, the rustling sound returned, but this time it was different. The movement wasn't heading back into the forest, it was coming closer. The leaves shifted again. Another careful step, then another, slow, measured, like someone approaching the house. I felt my shoulders tense slightly. The sound was definitely closer now, close enough that if the curtains weren't covering the windows, I probably would have been able to see the person standing in the yard. The movement stopped again, right outside the back wall of the house. For a moment, I wondered if whoever it was could hear the television from inside, or maybe see the glow of the lamp through the curtains. Another 30 seconds passed, then the rustling sound started again, but this time it moved sideways, across the yard, not toward the door, not toward the shed, just slowly walking along the edge of the forest behind the house, like someone circling the property. I stayed completely still on the couch, listening as the sound moved farther to the right side of the yard, then gradually faded. A few moments later, the forest was quiet again. I sat there for several minutes after that, waiting to see if the sound would return, but it didn't. Eventually, I turned off the television and went to bed. The house remained quiet for the rest of the night, but the next morning, when I stepped outside for the first time that day, I noticed something that made the situation feel much more real, because the ground at the edge of the yard was covered with dry pine needles, and across those needles, there were clear marks showing exactly where someone had been walking the night before, right along the tree line behind the house. The next morning started like every other morning that week, sunlight filtering through the trees, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. My grandmother already awake before I came out of my room. For a moment, everything felt normal again. But when I stepped outside onto the back porch, I remembered the sounds from the night before, the slow movement along the edge of the forest, the leaves shifting, someone walking just beyond the yard. The morning air was cool, and the forest looked peaceful in the daylight. Birds were moving through the branches again, the same quiet sounds of nature I had gotten used to hearing. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. Then I walked down the small wooden steps from the porch into the yard, and that's when I saw it. The ground near the tree line was covered in dry pine needles and patches of loose dirt. Across those needles, there were marks, long, shallow disturbances where something had moved through them. They weren't animal tracks. Animals usually leave small prints or scattered patterns. These marks were different. They looked like the path someone's shoes might make when walking slowly across soft ground. A narrow line of disturbed needles stretching along the edge of the forest. I followed the marks with my eyes. They started near one corner of the yard, moved along the entire tree line, then disappeared back into the woods, exactly where I had heard the movement the night before. I stood there for a minute, staring at the ground, trying to decide if I should mention it to my grandmother, but before I could make that decision, I heard the back door open behind me. She stepped out onto the porch with her coffee mug. "Morning," she said. I turned slightly and nodded. "Morning." She noticed where I was looking, then her eyes followed the same direction toward the ground near the trees. For a few seconds, she didn't say anything. Then she walked slowly down the porch steps and joined me in the yard. Her gaze moved along the line of disturbed pine needles. She didn't seem surprised, which somehow made the situation feel even stranger. "You heard something last night," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Someone walking along the trees." She studied the ground quietly for a moment. Then she looked toward the forest itself. The tall pines stood close together, their branches blocking much of the deeper view. From the yard, you could only see maybe 20 or 30 feet into the woods before the trees grew too dense. Beyond that, everything faded into shadow. My grandmother took a slow sip of coffee. Then she said something quietly. "She's been getting closer." The way she said it made the back of my neck tighten slightly. "You think that was her?" I asked. She nodded once. "Probably." I looked back toward the disturbed ground again. The marks definitely looked human, not large, not heavy, but clearly made by someone walking, and they had stopped right at the edge of the yard, like whoever made them had intentionally avoided stepping fully into the open space near the house. I had another question. "Has she come this close before?" My grandmother didn't answer immediately. She looked toward the forest again. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "Once or twice." That answer made the situation feel a lot more serious. "You mean recently?" I asked. "No," she said. "A long time ago." She walked back toward the porch slowly, still looking toward the trees. I followed her. When we reached the steps, she turned slightly and faced the forest again. For a few seconds, she just stood there watching the tree line. Then she spoke again. Sometimes she just watches. That phrase felt familiar. Watching, standing between the trees, the same description people had given for years. Still, I tried to keep the situation rational in my mind. Maybe the woman simply lived somewhere nearby and occasionally walked through the area. Maybe she avoided people during the day but moved around at night. That explanation seemed possible, but something about the marks in the pine needles kept bothering me, because whoever had walked along the edge of the yard had clearly taken their time. The steps weren't hurried. They weren't scattered like someone passing through. They moved slowly along the tree line, like someone deliberately walking around the house, observing it. Later that afternoon, I went for another walk along one of the forest trails, not as far as before, just enough to clear my head. The forest looked completely normal again in the daylight. Sunlight through branches, birds calling, wind moving softly through the trees. Still, I kept looking between the trunks as I walked, half expecting to see the woman standing there again. But I didn't. The trails were empty. Eventually, I turned back toward the house, and when I reached the clearing near the backyard, something immediately caught my attention, because someone was standing at the edge of the forest, not deep between the trees like before, much closer, right where the yard began. At first, I thought it might be my grandmother, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. The figure was thinner, taller, long dark hair hanging down past the shoulders, and she was standing completely still, facing the house. From where I stood on the trail, I could see her profile through the trees. She was only about 30 feet from the yard, close enough that if someone had been looking out the living room window, they would have been able to see her clearly. For a moment, I froze where I was, watching. The woman didn't move, didn't shift her weight, didn't look around. She simply stood there, staring toward the house. And then something strange happened, slowly, almost gently. She turned her head, not toward the house, toward me, even though I was standing partially hidden between two trees on the trail. Even though I hadn't made any sound, somehow, she knew exactly where I was, and for the first time since I arrived at my grandmother's house, I realized something that made my stomach tighten. She hadn't just been watching the house, she had been watching me too. When her head turned toward me, I felt something in my chest tighten immediately. It wasn't panic, not exactly. It was more like the sudden awareness that something I had been trying to explain logically might not be as simple as I thought. The trail behind me was quiet. No wind, no birds, just the soft smell of pine and dry earth. And about 30 feet ahead, standing at the edge of the forest near my grandmother's yard, was the woman. She didn't react the way a normal person would if they noticed someone watching them. She didn't look surprised. She didn't step back. She didn't ask who I was. She simply turned her head and looked directly at me. For a few seconds, we just stood there, neither of us moving. The distance between us wasn't far, close enough that I could finally see details I hadn't been able to see before. Her hair was long and dark, hanging loosely past her shoulders. Her clothing looked faded and pale, maybe gray or off-white, something that blended strangely with the forest shadows. But what I noticed most was her face, not because it was frightening, because it wasn't. If anything, her expression was calm, almost completely neutral. No anger, no fear, no curiosity, just stillness. Her skin looked unusually pale compared to the surrounding forest light. And her eyes, I remember noticing her eyes most clearly. They weren't wide, they weren't intense, they were simply focused, looking straight at me, the same way someone might watch something moving slowly in the distance, like she had already been aware of me long before I stopped walking. For a moment, I considered speaking, just saying something simple. "Hello," or asking if she needed help. But something about the silence between us made that feel like the wrong decision, because the way she was standing there didn't feel like someone who needed help. It felt like someone who had chosen to be exactly where she was and had no intention of leaving. Several seconds passed like that. The forest remained completely still. Then she did something that made the situation feel even stranger. She slowly tilted her head slightly to one side. Not much, just enough to change the angle of her gaze, like someone observing something more carefully. And then, very slowly, she took a single step backward, not turning away, not breaking eye contact, just stepping back between the trees. Then another step, still watching me. Within a few seconds, the branches and shadows began to hide parts of her figure. The deeper she moved into the forest, the harder it became to see her clearly. But even as the darkness between the trees swallowed more of her shape, I could still see her face, still watching, still completely calm. Then one final step carried her deeper into the shadows, and suddenly, she was gone. No sound of leaves, no branches moving, just empty space between the trees. I stayed where I was for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened, because the entire encounter had felt strange in a way I couldn't fully explain. Not threatening, not aggressive, just unnatural. Eventually, I turned and walked the rest of the way back to the house. When I reached the yard, my grandmother was sitting on the porch again, reading like she usually did in the afternoons. She looked up as I approached. "You went walking again," she said. I nodded, then I hesitated. Part of me wasn't sure if I should mention what I had just seen, but something about the situation made it feel important. "I saw her again," I said. My grandmother didn't look surprised. She simply closed the book in her lap slowly. "Where?" "Near the yard," I said. That made her eyebrows lift slightly. "How close?" "Right at the tree line." For a moment she didn't speak, then she stood up from the chair and walked to the edge of the porch. Her eyes moved toward the forest behind the house, the same area where I had just seen the woman standing. "Did she say anything?" she asked. "No." "Did she approach you?" "No." "What did she do?" I thought about the moment carefully. "She just watched." My grandmother nodded quietly. That response seemed to confirm something for her. Then she said something that made the entire situation feel even more unsettling. "She's curious." I frowned slightly. "Curious about what?" My grandmother didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the forest again. Then she said something very calmly. "About you." The way she said it made the air feel slightly heavier, because until that moment, I had been assuming the woman was simply observing the house or passing through the forest. But if my grandmother was right, then the woman's attention wasn't focused on the house at all. It was focused on me. And that realization became even more disturbing later that night, because that was the night when I heard something outside my bedroom window again. Except this time, it wasn't just footsteps in the leaves. It sounded like someone whispering. That night felt different from the beginning, not dramatically different. Nothing obvious had changed in the house. Dinner was normal. My grandmother cooked like she usually did. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, a neighbor who might be selling their property, small everyday topics. But even while we talked, I kept thinking about the moment in the forest, the way the woman had turned her head toward me, the way she had stepped backward into the trees without ever looking away, and what my grandmother had said afterward. "She's curious about you." I tried to tell myself that didn't mean anything. Maybe my grandmother had just been guessing. Maybe the woman simply noticed someone new walking the trails. But the thought stayed with me the entire evening. After dinner, my grandmother followed the same routine she always did. She checked the locks, closed the curtains, made sure the windows were shut. Then she wished me good night and went to her room. The house grew quiet not long after that. Around 11, I went to bed as well. For a while, I lay there listening to the forest outside, wind moving through branches, occasional insects, normal sounds. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, but sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly, not from a loud noise, more like a subtle sound that had pulled me awake. At first, I stayed still, trying to figure out what I had heard. The room was dark, the house silent. Then I heard it again. A faint rustling sound outside the window, leaves shifting slowly, the same sound I had heard the night before, someone moving carefully across the forest floor. I held my breath slightly and listened. The sound came again, closer this time, right near the wall of the house. Then it stopped, just like before. The silence that followed felt incredibly heavy, like whoever had been moving outside had stopped intentionally. I stared toward the window. The curtains were closed, but I could still see the faint outline of moonlight around the edges of the fabric. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, very quietly, I heard something else. At first, I thought it was the wind, a soft sound brushing across the outside of the house. But then the sound came again, and this time I realized what it was. Someone was whispering. The sound came again, closer this time, right near the wall of the house. Then it stopped, just like before. The silence that followed felt incredibly heavy, like whoever had been moving outside had stopped intentionally. I stared toward the window. The curtains were closed, but I could still see the faint outline of moonlight around the edges of the fabric. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, very quietly, I heard something else. At first, I thought it was the wind, a soft sound brushing across the outside of the house. But then the sound came again, and this time I realized what it was. Someone was whispering. The sound was incredibly faint, barely louder than the rustling leaves had been, but it was definitely a voice, coming from just outside the window. I sat up slowly in bed, my eyes fixed on the curtain. The whisper came again, soft, almost breath-like, and then, for a brief moment, I heard something inside that whisper that made my stomach drop, because it sounded like a word. I stayed completely still, listening as carefully as I could. The whisper returned, longer this time, and suddenly I understood what I was hearing. It was my name, very quiet, almost impossible to make out clearly, but unmistakable. Someone outside the window was whispering my name. My entire body felt tense, not just from fear, from confusion, because there was only one way someone outside could know my name. They would have had to hear it earlier, from inside the house, maybe during the day while my grandmother called for me, or during dinner. But that meant one thing. The woman in the forest hadn't just been watching from a distance. She had been close enough to hear us, close enough to learn my name. The whisper came again, soft, slow, almost patient, like someone trying to get my attention without waking the rest of the house. I stayed frozen on the bed, my eyes locked on the curtain. For a moment, I thought about getting up, pulling the curtain aside, looking outside, but something deep in my mind told me not to, because if I did that, I would probably see her standing there, only a few feet away, watching, waiting. The whisper happened one more time, then the leaves outside shifted again, a slow step across the forest floor, another. The sound began moving away from the house, back toward the trees. Within a few seconds, the movement faded completely, and the forest returned to silence. I didn't sleep much after that. I stayed awake in the dark for what felt like hours, listening for any sign of movement outside, but the whisper never came back. The next morning, when I told my grandmother what I had heard, she didn't react the way I expected. She didn't seem shocked or frightened. Instead, she became very quiet. Then she said something that made the situation feel much more serious. "She's trying to get you to come outside." That idea hadn't even occurred to me yet, but the moment she said it, it made a strange kind of sense, because the whisper hadn't sounded threatening. It hadn't sounded angry. If anything, it sounded inviting, patient, like someone calling gently from the darkness, waiting for an answer. And that was the moment I started realizing something that made the entire situation far more disturbing. The woman in the forest wasn't just watching anymore. She was trying to communicate, and if she was willing to stand outside my window at night whispering my name, then the next time she appeared, she might come even closer to the house. After I told my grandmother about the whisper outside my window, the entire mood in the house changed, not dramatically. She didn't panic. She didn't call anyone, but something about her behavior that day felt different, more cautious, more attentive to the forest. That morning, she walked around the house checking the windows again, even though she had already done that the night before. She made sure the locks on both doors worked properly. She even moved one of the old wooden chairs so it rested against the back door, not blocking it exactly, just positioned there. Like an extra precaution, I noticed all of it, and the fact that she was doing those things without explaining them made the situation feel more serious than if she had simply told me she was worried. Later that afternoon, I didn't go walking in the forest. For the first time since arriving, I stayed close to the house. Part of me kept wondering if the woman might appear again near the yard, but the forest remained quiet all day. The sunlight moved slowly through the trees, birds passed overhead. Nothing unusual. Even my grandmother seemed calmer by the evening. Dinner felt normal again. We talked about family, about how long I planned to stay that summer, about some repairs she wanted to do to the porch. But when the sun started lowering behind the trees, she followed her routine even more carefully than before. The doors were locked earlier than usual, the curtains were closed completely, and the porch light stayed off. After dinner, we both went to our rooms earlier than normal. I think we were both tired from the tension of the past few days. For a while that night, everything seemed peaceful. I fell asleep quickly, but sometime later, I woke up again. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was a sound that was much clearer, a slow, scraping noise. At first I thought it might be a branch brushing against the house, but the wind outside was completely still. Then the sound came again, a long, slow scratch, like something dragging lightly across wood. I sat up in bed. The sound was coming from somewhere in the house, not the window, the back door. Another scratch, long, deliberate. My chest tightened as I listened, because the sound didn't resemble an animal trying to get inside. It was too controlled, too careful, almost like someone gently running their fingers along the surface of the door. I got out of bed quietly and walked toward the hallway. The house was dark, except for faint moonlight coming through the edges of the curtains. As I stepped into the hallway, I could hear the sound more clearly now. Scratch, pause, scratch, coming from the back door in the kitchen. I moved slowly down the hallway. Every creak of the floorboards sounded louder than usual. When I reached the corner of the kitchen wall, I stopped. From there, I could see the door, and the faint outline of the chair my grandmother had leaned against it earlier. The scratching happened again, soft, slow. Then it stopped. For a moment, the silence felt incredibly heavy. And then something else happened. A voice, very quiet, coming through the door. At first it sounded like the same whisper from the night before, but this time the words were clearer, not loud, but close enough to understand. My name. She was whispering my name again, right on the other side of the door. The realization made my stomach tighten, because that meant the woman wasn't standing near the forest anymore. She was standing on the back porch, only a few feet away. I stayed frozen where I was, listening. The whisper came again, soft, patient, like someone waiting for a response. I thought about waking my grandmother, but before I could move, something unexpected happened. From down the hallway behind me, I heard her bedroom door open. My grandmother stepped into the hallway. She must have heard the sound too. For a moment, we looked at each other in the dim light. Neither of us said anything. Then the whisper came again. This time, both of us heard it clearly. My name. My grandmother's expression hardened immediately. She stepped forward slowly until she was standing beside me in the hallway. The whisper stopped. For several seconds, the house remained completely silent. Then my grandmother spoke, not loudly, but firmly enough to carry through the door. "You need to leave." Her voice was calm, controlled. The silence outside lasted another few seconds. Then, very slowly, we heard movement on the porch, a step, then another, wood creaking lightly under weight. The sound moved away from the door, across the porch, then down the steps. A few seconds later, we heard the faint rustling of leaves near the trees, and then nothing. The forest returned to silence again. My grandmother stood there for a moment, listening carefully. Then she turned to me and said something quietly. "She's getting bolder." I didn't answer, because in that moment, one realization had settled firmly in my mind. The woman in the forest had now walked all the way to the house. She had stood at the door, and she had called my name from just a few feet away. And if my grandmother hadn't woken up when she did, I don't know how long she would have stayed there. Waiting, the night after we heard the whisper at the door. Neither of us slept very well, but we didn't talk about it the next morning, not directly. My grandmother made coffee like she always did. The small radio played quietly on the kitchen counter. Outside, the forest looked calm again in the morning sunlight. Birds were moving through the branches, wind passed gently between the trees. If you didn't know what had happened during the night, the place looked perfectly normal, but something in the house felt different. My grandmother moved more slowly that morning. Every so often she would glance toward the windows, facing the forest. Not nervously, just carefully, like someone checking something. After breakfast, she made a phone call from the hallway. The house didn't have cell service, so the old landline was the only way to reach anyone. I didn't hear the entire conversation, but I heard enough to understand she was speaking to my parents. Her voice was calm, almost casual. She talked about the weather for a moment, then she said something that caught my attention. "I think I'll come stay in town for a while." There was a pause while the other person spoke. Then she nodded slowly. "Yes, I think that might be better." When she hung up the phone, she stood quietly in the hallway for a few seconds. Then she walked back into the kitchen and poured another cup of coffee. Neither of us mentioned the whisper, but we both understood something had changed. Later that afternoon, we packed a few things into the car. Not everything, just a couple bags, clothes, personal items, things we might need for a few days. The house itself stayed exactly the way it was. Before we left, my grandmother walked slowly through each room one last time, checking the windows, looking around the living room, almost like she was saying goodbye to a place she had lived in for a long time. When she reached the back door, she paused. Her eyes moved toward the forest behind the house. The trees stood exactly the way they always had, tall, silent, motionless. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she locked the door, and we left. The gravel road leading away from the house curved through the forest for nearly 10 minutes before it connected with the main road toward town. As we drove, the trees slowly swallowed the view of the house behind us. Eventually, it disappeared completely. Still, at one point, I glanced at the rearview mirror. And for just a second, I had the strange feeling that someone might be standing somewhere between those trees, watching the car drive away. But if anyone was there, I couldn't see them. My grandmother never went back to that house again. At first, she stayed with my parents for a few weeks, then a few months. Eventually, it became permanent. As she got older, it became harder for her to live alone anyway, so moving into town was probably the right decision. Years later, the property was sold. Another family owns the land now. As far as I know, they still live there, and I've never heard any stories from them. Maybe nothing strange ever happened again, or maybe they simply never talked about it. My grandmother passed away a few years ago, peacefully, surrounded by family. Sometimes I wish I had asked her more questions about that summer before she was gone, but she never brought it up again, and neither did I. Still, every now and then I think about that forest, the quiet, the trees, the way the darkness looked between them after sunset, and the woman standing there, perfectly still, watching the house, watching the trails, watching me. I still don't know who she was. Maybe she was just someone living alone deep in the forest. Maybe the stories about her were nothing more than local rumors. Or maybe the people in that area avoided walking the forest at night for a reason. Because sometimes, late at night, when everything outside my house is quiet, I remember the sound of that whisper outside the window, soft, patient, calling my name. And every time I remember it, I think about one small detail that still bothers me. That night, when she whispered through the door, my grandmother told her to leave, and she did. She walked back into the forest without arguing, without making another sound, almost like she understood the rule, like she knew the house was still protected. And that makes me wonder something I've never been able to answer. What would have happened if one night I had opened the door myself